An elderly black man, Mr. Johnson, stepped into the dealership showroom, his slow, steady gait giving him a quiet dignity. He wore a simple, worn-out jacket and scuffed shoes. Nothing fancy, but there was something composed in the way he moved. His face held a calm expression, his eyes taking in the luxurious vehicles around him, each car polished to perfection under the bright showroom lights. Mr. Johnson seemed to have no rush, his gaze lingering on each model, appreciating details as if he knew a thing or two about these expensive cars. Across the room, Mark, a young, ambitious salesman, leaned back against a sleek sports car with a smirk on his face. Dressed in a sharp suit and polished shoes, Mark looked every bit the part of a flashy salesman who prided himself on his ability to spot serious buyers from casual browsers. As he watched Mr. Johnson approach the high-end cars, he raised an eyebrow, muttering under his breath to a coworker standing nearby. "Another one of those, huh? Probably doesn't even know what these cars cost." Mark chuckled quietly, already assuming that Mr. Johnson was here to look, not buy. To him it was obvious. An older man dressed so plainly couldn't possibly afford one of the high-end models. Deciding to approach, Mark straightened his suit jacket and walked over with a forced, overly friendly smile. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, the friendliness in his tone barely masking a hint of condescension. "Can I help you find something? Maybe point you to our more affordable options?" Mark's gaze swept over Mr. Johnson from head to toe, clearly assessing him as someone who didn't belong in the luxury section of the showroom. Mr. Johnson looked up, unaffected by Mark's tone or the unspoken judgment in his words. He smiled slightly and nodded toward a sleek, top-of-the-line SUV parked nearby. "I'm actually interested in that model," he said in a soft, calm voice. His words carried a certain curiosity and appreciation that made it clear he knew exactly what he was talking about. "I've read it has a strong engine, excellent control, and is built for a smooth ride even on rough terrain," he continued, his voice thoughtful as he mentioned specific features that only someone knowledgeable would know. Mark's smile wavered for a moment, surprised that this man seemed to know so much about the SUV, but he quickly covered it up, flashing another dismissive grin. "Oh yes, that's our premium model," he replied with a hint of amusement in his voice. "Definitely one of our more exclusive vehicles. Quite a price tag on it too," he added, as if trying to discourage Mr. Johnson from taking any further interest. He didn't think much of the elderly man's questions, assuming he was simply another curious onlooker with no real intention of buying. Mr. Johnson continued looking at the SUV, undeterred. He asked another question about the engine's fuel efficiency, nodding thoughtfully as he listened to Mark's half-hearted answer. Mark grew visibly impatient, shifting his weight and glancing around the showroom, hoping for a more promising customer to walk in. To him, this was a waste of time. Mr. Johnson kept his composure, his interest in the SUV unfazed by Mark's impatience. He continued his line of questions, each one thoughtful and specific, delving deeper into the vehicle's features. He asked about the safety ratings, the advanced technology used in the braking system, and even mentioned the recent upgrades the model had received. His tone was polite, almost gentle, but it held a quiet authority, the kind that hinted he knew more than he let on. As he spoke, a couple of the junior sales staff nearby couldn't help but notice and exchange puzzled glances, impressed by the elderly man's depth of knowledge. Mark, however, was losing patience. He barely answered, giving short, clipped responses as he fought to keep his forced smile. He was itching to move on, convinced this man was wasting his time. "Well, sir," he said in a tone laced with poorly masked irritation, "as I said, this SUV isn't exactly within the reach of everyone." He emphasized the last word with a smirk, as if to make sure Mr. Johnson understood his implication. The message was clear. In Mark's eyes, someone who looked like Mr. Johnson didn't belong in this showroom, let alone inquiring about a top-tier model. But Mr. Johnson only nodded, unfazed by the comment. He turned his attention to the young couple who had just entered the showroom. They were browsing the lower-end models, whispering to each other with hopeful expressions as they discussed prices. Sensing their hesitation, Mr. Johnson quietly excused himself from Mark and walked over to them with a friendly smile. He spoke to them softly, offering a few encouraging words and sharing his thoughts on the models they were considering. His presence seemed to put the couple at ease, and they smiled gratefully, thanking him for his advice. Watching from a distance, Mark grew visibly irritated. He frowned, rolling his eyes, muttering under his breath about time wasters. To him, Mr. Johnson was not only wasting his time, but now interfering with other potential buyers. He approached the elderly man again, his voice colder this time, losing the fake friendliness altogether. "Sir, if you're not serious about making a purchase, I'd suggest you let me handle the customers who are," he said, his tone sharp and condescending. His patience had finally run out and he made no attempt to hide his disdain. Mr. Johnson glanced at Mark, his expression calm and unbothered by the rudeness. He simply nodded, offering a polite, "Of course," before stepping back. The young couple looked uncomfortable, throwing nervous glances between Mark and Mr. Johnson. Sensing their unease, Mr. Johnson smiled gently at them and offered one last piece of advice about the car they were interested in, then quietly moved to another part of the showroom. As he continued browsing, Mark followed him, keeping a close eye on him, still visibly annoyed. "This section," he said with a tight smile, gesturing toward the most luxurious models on display, "is reserved for our premium customers. These cars, they're in a league of their own. Very few can afford them." He chuckled, shaking his head as though he were speaking to a child who didn't understand how the world worked. But Mr. Johnson's expression didn't change. He simply tilted his head, studying Mark as though considering something. "These cars do have a reputation," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "They're built with precision and they're crafted to last. I imagine they attract a certain type of customer, those who value quality over flash." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Mark seemed taken aback by the insight, though he quickly masked it. As the conversation continued, Mr. Johnson asked one more question, one that only an insider or someone with deep knowledge would ask. He mentioned a minor but crucial detail about the SUV's new braking system, a feature that hadn't been widely publicized. The mention of it threw Mark off completely. His smirk faltered, and he stared at Mr. Johnson with a puzzled frown. How could this elderly man, who looked like he barely belonged in the dealership, know something so specific about a high-end model? Mark blinked, momentarily thrown by Mr. Johnson's question. He struggled to come up with a response, his mind racing to recall the details of the braking system Mr. Johnson had mentioned. A hint of uncertainty flashed in his eyes, and he quickly forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Ah, yes, well, I'm sure that's a feature some of our customers might find useful," he said, his tone hesitant. But the confidence in his voice had slipped, and the smugness that had been so present before was starting to waver. Mr. Johnson watched him patiently, his gaze steady but unassuming. His calmness in the face of Mark's dismissive attitude only added to the aura of quiet authority he seemed to carry. There was something in Mr. Johnson's eyes, a wisdom and strength that came from years of experience, a certainty that didn't require boasting or posturing. It was clear that he wasn't in any rush to prove himself or demand respect. He simply observed, letting Mark dig himself deeper with each word. Seeing that his vague answer hadn't fazed Mr. Johnson, Mark's frustration bubbled over. He decided to try another approach. "Look," he said, barely masking his irritation, "I've been in this business for years. I know who's serious about buying and who isn't." He took a step closer, lowering his voice as though sharing some great secret. "And no offense, but you don't exactly fit the profile of our usual customers. These cars, they're investments. Only people who understand the value of that kind of commitment even consider them." His voice had a smug tone again, as if he thought he'd finally managed to put Mr. Johnson in his place. But instead of reacting, Mr. Johnson only raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Investments, you say?" he echoed, his tone thoughtful. "I suppose you're right. I've made a few of those myself over the years. The kind that require commitment, patience, and a certain understanding of value. There was something in his words, a subtle confidence, that didn't quite match his modest appearance. At that moment, a junior salesperson named Linda entered the showroom, spotting Mr. Johnson from across the room. Her eyes widened slightly, and her posture straightened. She walked over with a respectful nod, her demeanor immediately warmer than Mark's had been. "Mr. Johnson," she said, genuine surprise and delight in her voice. "It's so nice to see you again. How have you been?" Mark's face shifted instantly. He looked between Linda and Mr. Johnson, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Wait, you know him?" he stammered, unable to hide his shock. Linda looked at Mark, surprised by his reaction. "Yes, of course," she replied smoothly. "Mr. Johnson is, well, he's the owner." She turned to Mr. Johnson, her respect evident in the way she spoke to him. "Everyone was hoping you'd stop by soon. We've had a few questions about the expansion plans you mentioned last month." Mark's mouth dropped open, his face draining of color as he finally understood. Mark's face flushed with embarrassment as the reality of the situation settled in. He stood there, stunned, feeling the weight of his own arrogance and the assumptions he had made about Mr. Johnson. A nervous laugh escaped his lips as he tried to regain his composure, but his usual confidence had completely crumbled. He glanced around the showroom, aware that a few other staff members were watching the scene unfold, whispering amongst themselves. The whole room seemed to feel the tension, as Mark struggled to find the right words, his mind racing with regret. Mr. Johnson, however, didn't revel in Mark's discomfort. He remained calm, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady as he looked at Mark. He waited patiently, giving Mark the space to process the situation. Finally, Mark managed to stammer out an apology, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, Mr. Johnson," he said, the arrogance replaced by a newfound humility. "I didn't realize who you were. I didn't know that you—" He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence, knowing that any attempt to justify his behavior would only make things worse. Mr. Johnson nodded, accepting the apology with quiet grace. "It's all right," he said calmly, his tone gentle but firm. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." There was a pause, a moment of silence that felt heavy with meaning. Mark could only nod, feeling the weight of Mr. Johnson's words. He realized that this man wasn't just teaching him about respect for others, but also about humility, a lesson he hadn't even known he needed. Mr. Johnson looked around the showroom thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping over the cars and the people working there. "You see, Mark," he said, his voice steady and filled with a quiet wisdom, "a dealership like this isn't built on cars alone. It's built on relationships, trust, and respect. The people who walk through these doors, they're not just customers. They're people with stories, experiences, dreams. Every person deserves respect, no matter what they look like or how they dress." Mark's cheeks burned with shame as he listened. He'd spent years in sales, priding himself on his instincts, his ability to judge customers quickly. But in a few short minutes, Mr. Johnson had shattered those assumptions, exposing the flaws in his thinking. It wasn't just about making a sale. It was about understanding people, seeing beyond appearances. The lesson cut deeper than any reprimand could have, and for the first time, Mark realized just how much he had to learn. Linda watched the exchange with a small, knowing smile, sensing that this was a moment that would change Mark. She had seen Mr. Johnson's quiet wisdom before, his ability to turn even the simplest conversation into a lesson. And now, watching Mark's reaction, she knew that Mr. Johnson had left an impression that would stay with him long after this moment had passed. Mr. Johnson gave a final encouraging nod to Mark, then turned to Linda. "I believe we were discussing the expansion plans," he said, his tone shifting to one of business, as if the previous conversation had been nothing more than a small matter. Linda nodded, pulling out a notebook to go over some details. But even as they discussed logistics, Mark stood by, feeling as though he had been given a glimpse of something much bigger than himself. Mark lingered nearby, trying to collect himself, still reeling from the reality that had just unfolded. The man he had dismissed so easily, the one he thought had no business in a high-end dealership, was not only knowledgeable, but owned the entire establishment. As he watched Mr. Johnson and Linda discussing business details, he couldn't help but reflect on his own behavior. Every smug remark, every dismissive gesture replayed in his mind, now casting him in an unflattering light he couldn't ignore. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he truly understood the gravity of his mistake. As Mr. Johnson finished his conversation with Linda, he turned back toward the showroom floor, his gaze once again sweeping over the various models. After a brief pause, he looked directly at Mark, motioning him over with a subtle nod. Mark swallowed hard, feeling both nervous and hopeful. Nervous because he knew he deserved a reprimand, but hopeful that perhaps there was still a chance to redeem himself. When Mark reached him, Mr. Johnson spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I noticed you have a way with people, Mark," he began, catching Mark off guard. For a moment, Mark was confused, unsure if Mr. Johnson was being sarcastic or sincere. "It's not easy to connect with everyone who walks in here," Mr. Johnson continued, his tone making it clear that he wasn't mocking. "In this business, reading people is important, but it's even more important to see them beyond the surface." Mark nodded, absorbing every word, his earlier arrogance now replaced by genuine humility. "I understand, Mr. Johnson. I really do. I made a huge mistake, and I'm sorry for judging you the way I did." He hesitated, then added, "I thought I knew who would be a serious buyer and who wouldn't, but clearly I was wrong." Mr. Johnson offered him a gentle smile, a look of understanding in his eyes. "We all make assumptions, Mark. The key is to learn from them." He glanced back toward the young couple who were still browsing the cars, seemingly unaware of the lesson unfolding around them. Respect is something you should never withhold, regardless of how someone looks, dresses, or even acts. True respect is given freely, not based on appearances or first impressions. Mark followed Mr. Johnson's gaze, watching the young couple who were now cautiously looking at a mid-range model. Their expressions were hopeful but tinged with uncertainty, and it was clear they weren't sure if they could afford the car they wanted. Mr. Johnson's expression softened as he watched them, a subtle kindness in his eyes that hinted at the generosity he often showed to those who needed it most. Without another word, Mr. Johnson walked over to the couple, engaging them in conversation. Mark watched, feeling both inspired and ashamed. He realized that Mr. Johnson had no intention of holding a grudge or punishing him for his behavior. Instead, Mr. Johnson was giving him a far more valuable lesson, one about empathy, humility, and the true meaning of respect. Mr. Johnson approached the young couple with the same warmth and genuine interest he'd shown all along, his demeanor making them feel instantly at ease. The couple, a young man and woman, looked slightly startled at first, glancing at each other as if unsure how to react to the elderly man's approach. But Mr. Johnson's calm, kind smile reassured them, and soon they were deep in conversation. He asked them gentle, open-ended questions, encouraging them to share their story, why they'd come in today, what they were looking for, and what brought them to this particular dealership. The young man explained that they'd been saving up for months to buy a reliable car, something that would get them to work and help with errands as they built their life together. They wanted something safe and dependable, but hadn't thought they could afford the nicer models. As he spoke, there was a glint of pride in his eyes, mingled with a hint of worry, as though he was already prepared for disappointment. The young woman, holding his hand tightly, smiled at Mr. Johnson, her gratitude clear as she realized he was genuinely listening, not just trying to push a sale. Mr. Johnson nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious but kind. He glanced at the car they'd been looking at, a mid-range model known for its reliability and good safety features, and then back at them. "You know," he said, his voice soft but full of warmth, "that's a solid choice. It's practical, reliable, and it'll serve you well as you start this journey together." His words carried a weight, and the couple exchanged glances, visibly touched by the sincerity in his tone. Meanwhile, Mark stood a few steps back, watching the interaction with growing respect and newfound understanding. He'd never seen someone so effortlessly connect with customers without the usual sales tactics. There were no rehearsed lines, no hard sells, just a genuine interest in the people standing in front of him. Mark felt a strange mix of admiration and regret. He realized that Mr. Johnson's way of handling people went beyond just making them comfortable. He was building trust and showing them that he valued them as individuals. In that moment, Mark saw the gap between Mr. Johnson's approach and his own, and the realization humbled him further. As their conversation continued, Mr. Johnson could sense the couple's hesitation, their uncertainty about whether they could truly afford the car they wanted. Smiling softly, he reached into his pocket and took out a small business card-sized note. He handed it to them with a gentle nod. "Take this," he said simply, "and show it to Linda at the front desk when you're ready. It'll take care of the down payment for you. Consider it a small gift to get you started." The young woman's eyes widened, her hand going to her mouth in shock. "Are you serious?" she whispered, glancing down at the card and then back at Mr. Johnson, barely able to contain her gratitude. The young man was equally stunned, his mouth hanging open as he struggled to find the right words. We can't accept this, sir. It's too generous." But Mr. Johnson only smiled, his eyes twinkling with a kindness that spoke of years of wisdom. "Sometimes we all need a little help," he said softly. "I was in your shoes once long ago. If someone hadn't extended a hand to me, I wouldn't be here today. Think of this as my way of paying that kindness forward. Just promise me one thing," he added with a gentle smile. "When you're in a position to help someone else, don't hesitate to do it." The couple nodded, tears of gratitude in their eyes. They thanked him repeatedly, their voices choked with emotion, and as they moved toward the front desk to speak with Linda, they looked back at Mr. Johnson, still visibly overwhelmed by his generosity. Mr. Johnson waved, his smile soft but full of warmth. Mark, who had watched the entire scene in silence, felt something shift inside him. For so long he had viewed sales as a transaction, a way to close deals and make commissions. But here was Mr. Johnson, showing him that it was something deeper, a chance to connect, to understand, and, when possible, to make a difference in someone's life. In all his years in the business, Mark had never considered this perspective, but now it felt as though a new door had opened, one that would forever change how he approached his work. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he'd witnessed, and approached Mr. Johnson, who stood watching the couple with a satisfied look. "Mr. Johnson," Mark began, his voice thick with a newfound respect. "Thank you for that. I never realized how much more this job could be. I've been looking at it all wrong, and you've shown me what it really means to connect with people. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you earlier. I see now that I was only seeing what I wanted to see, not the whole person." Mr. Johnson looked at him with the same gentle, knowing smile he had worn all along. "That's all right, Mark," he said, nodding as if he'd heard this apology before. "It's never too late to change how you see things. Just remember, respect is something you carry in your heart, not something you give only when you think it's deserved." He placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, his touch firm yet reassuring, leaving Mark with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in a long time. The moment lingered, both men understanding that something profound had just taken place. Mr. Johnson's words would remain with Mark, guiding him far beyond the walls of the dealership, reshaping how he viewed both his work and his life. Mr. Johnson patted Mark's shoulder and then stepped back, giving him a thoughtful look. "You know, Mark," he began, his voice carrying a gentle tone of encouragement, "you're not the first person to make assumptions, but what matters most is what you do after realizing the truth." Mr. Johnson's words were kind, but they resonated with a powerful simplicity. For a moment, Mark felt as though he were speaking to a mentor, someone who had lived through years of experience and could see right through him. It was humbling, yet somehow reassuring. Mr. Johnson then glanced around the showroom, a fond expression softening his features as he looked at the place he had built from the ground up. "When I first started, I wasn't much different from the people who walk in here every day," he continued. "Young, ambitious, unsure of myself, hoping to build a better life. I was given an opportunity, one that many people thought I didn't deserve." He paused, his eyes distant as if recalling memories from long ago. "But I learned that respect, kindness, and hard work can take you much further than any judgment or prejudice ever will." Mark listened, hanging on to every word, feeling a newfound respect growing for this man who had been so unassuming, yet had such a remarkable story behind him. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I always assumed success was about closing deals, hitting targets, showing confidence. But now I see that there's more to it. You've shown me that it's also about empathy and understanding." Mr. Johnson nodded, his eyes twinkling with approval. "Exactly, Mark. People come here looking for more than just a car. They come looking for trust, for someone who can guide them and understand their needs. That's how you build loyalty, how you create something that lasts." He looked at Mark with a gaze that seemed to penetrate straight to his heart. "I believe you have the potential to do that, but it will take a change in how you see people and in how you treat them." Mark felt a surge of determination rise within him, a desire to prove himself worthy of Mr. Johnson's faith. He knew he couldn't undo the assumptions he'd made, but he could start to change from that moment onward. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," he said earnestly. "I want to do better, to be the kind of person who treats everyone with the respect they deserve. I promise I'll take what you've taught me to heart." Mr. Johnson smiled and nodded approvingly. "I'm glad to hear that, Mark. And remember, true change doesn't happen overnight, it's a journey. But as long as you're willing to learn and grow, you'll get there." He offered Mark a handshake, a gesture that held both encouragement and closure. Mark took his hand, feeling the strength and warmth in Mr. Johnson's grip, a final reminder of the wisdom he'd been given. As Mr. Johnson turned to leave, he walked back past the young couple, who were still finalizing their paperwork with Linda. He paused to give them one last encouraging smile, his presence leaving a lasting impression not only on them, but on everyone who had witnessed the day's events. Linda caught Mark's eye and gave him an approving nod, as if to say she had seen the change in him too. Mark felt a swell of gratitude, realizing that this day had become a turning point in his life, a lesson he would carry with him both in his work and in every encounter that lay ahead. As Mr. Johnson reached the door, he paused and turned around one last time, casting a final, thoughtful glance across the showroom. He seemed to take in everything: the polished cars, the sales staff now bustling with new energy, and the young couple chatting happily with Linda, excited about their future with their first car. His eyes lingered on Mark, a subtle nod of acknowledgement passing between them. There was no need for more words. The lesson had been given, and it was clear that Mark understood. Mark watched as Mr. Johnson stepped out, his humble yet powerful presence leaving a quiet imprint on the space. The other employees, who had observed bits and pieces of the day's events, now looked to Mark with curiosity and a hint of respect. They hadn't seen him humbled in this way before, and it was clear he had been changed by the encounter. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his own growth settle within him. He walked back toward the showroom floor with a new resolve, his perspective transformed. When he spotted a new customer approaching, a middle-aged woman with a hesitant expression, he straightened his jacket and approached her with a genuine smile, the kind he had seen Mr. Johnson use so naturally. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said warmly. "How can I help you today? Take your time. We're here to help you find exactly what you need." For the first time, his words were sincere, carrying a depth and understanding he hadn't possessed before. He noticed how her face relaxed, the hesitation giving way to a grateful smile as she felt genuinely welcome. Mark realized with a quiet sense of pride that he was beginning to put Mr. Johnson's lesson into practice. It was just the first step, but it felt right. like he was finally seeing people as they deserved to be seen, with respect and patience. As he continued helping the woman, Mark couldn't help but glance toward the door, half expecting to see Mr. Johnson watching. But the doorway was empty, and somehow that made him smile. Mr. Johnson had left, trusting Mark to carry the lesson forward on his own. And as Mark turned his attention back to the customer, he knew he would do exactly that, one respectful interaction at a time. Mark guided the woman around the showroom, patiently listening as she shared what she was looking for in a car. She explained that she wanted something reliable, not too flashy, but with enough room for her grandchildren, whom she loved taking on weekend outings. Mark nodded, genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions to understand her needs better. As she spoke, he found himself seeing her not just as a customer, but as a person with a story, someone who deserved respect and care. It was a shift he hadn't felt before, an authentic desire to connect, to help without pushing or rushing. As they walked, Mark noticed that his usual instincts were quieter now. In the past, he would have been focused on finding ways to sell, nudging her toward a model with a higher price tag or features she didn't need. But today he listened carefully, focusing on what would genuinely make her happy, not on his commission. They eventually paused by a spacious mid-range model that perfectly suited her needs. "This one has everything you mentioned. Great safety ratings, lots of room for the grandkids, and it's known for its reliability," he said with a smile, gesturing toward the car. The woman's face lit up as she examined the car, her fingers brushing lightly over the handle. "It's lovely," she murmured, her voice filled with a kind of quiet awe. "I've always wanted something like this, but I wasn't sure if I'd be able to find the right one." Mark could see the mix of excitement and apprehension in her eyes, the way she carefully weighed her hopes against her doubts. "Take your time," he said reassuringly, noticing her hesitation. "This is a big decision, and we want you to feel completely comfortable with it." He didn't try to push or convince her. He simply waited, letting her make the choice at her own pace. He realized that Mr. Johnson's approach was guiding him, leading him to put the customer's needs and comfort first, without the pressure of trying to close a deal. As she considered the car, she glanced at him with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for being so patient with me," she said, her tone genuine. "It's rare to feel that someone really cares about what I need, rather than just what I can afford." Her words hit Mark deeply, and he felt a wave of humility wash over him. In that moment, he understood how much his outlook had changed. He had always been in sales for the competition, the thrill of hitting targets, the chase of high commissions. But now, he could see the value in simply connecting with people, in understanding their stories, and being a small part of helping them achieve what they needed. It was a feeling far more fulfilling than any sale he'd ever made before. Mark walked her over to the front desk, where Linda was wrapping up the paperwork for the young couple Mr. Johnson had helped earlier. She glanced up at Mark, catching the look of quiet pride on his face, and gave him a small, approving nod. Linda had known Mr. Johnson for years, and had seen him guide many young salespeople through their first lessons in humility and empathy. But she sensed that Mark's transformation was particularly meaningful. She knew the old Mark, the one who'd been driven by ego and ambition. This new version, softened by Mr. Johnson's wisdom, was someone who could truly excel, not just as a salesman, but as a person. After finalizing the paperwork, Mark walked the woman outside to show her the car under natural light. She took a deep breath, running her hand along the car's smooth surface as she visualized herself behind the wheel. Mark stood nearby, silently supporting her decision, content to give her the space she needed. She finally turned to him, her eyes shining with joy and a bit of disbelief. "I'll take it," she said softly, her voice filled with excitement. Mark's heart swelled with pride, but it wasn't the same pride he'd felt in previous sales. This was different, deeper, more genuine. He knew he had earned her trust and respect by treating her with the dignity she deserved. "Congratulations," he said warmly, extending his hand to her. "I'm glad we found the right one for you." As they shook hands, The woman looked at him with a grateful smile, and he realized that this simple gesture, this human connection, was far more rewarding than any amount of money could bring. Watching her drive away, he felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond the sale. It was as if he had gained something far more valuable, a new way of seeing people, and, in turn, a new way of seeing himself. Mark headed back into the showroom, his mind still on Mr. Johnson's parting words. He knew he was just beginning this journey of change, but he felt ready, confident that he could live up to the lesson he'd been taught. He looked around the dealership with fresh eyes, seeing it not as a place of transactions but as a place of trust and respect. The day had been more than just a turning point. It had reshaped his values, creating a foundation he could build on. And as he resumed his work, he knew that in his own way, he was starting to follow in Mr. Johnson's footsteps, one respectful interaction at a time. As the day began to wind down, Mark found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The dealership was quieter now, with fewer customers browsing and a calm settled over the showroom. But inside, Mark's mind was far from quiet. Every interaction from the day replayed in his mind. Mr. Johnson's calm, thoughtful presence, the gentle lesson woven through each word, and the unspoken challenge to become a better version of himself. It felt like a profound moment of clarity, as if a door he hadn't known existed had opened, revealing a new path. Linda, who had been observing him from her desk, walked over, sensing the weight of his thoughts. She leaned against one of the display cars, giving him a knowing smile. "Quite a day, huh?" she asked gently, her voice full of warmth. "I don't think I've ever seen you this quiet, Mark." Mark chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, you're right. I guess today was eye-opening," he admitted, glancing down at his hands as if seeing them differently. "I thought I had this job figured out. I thought I knew how to handle people, close deals, get results. But now it feels like I was just skimming the surface." Linda nodded, her gaze understanding. "Mr. Johnson has a way of doing that," she replied. "He's always believed that people are the heart of this business. It's never just about cars to him. He built this place with the idea that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." Mark listened, letting her words sink in, feeling the truth resonate with his own realizations from the day. "I can see that now. It's strange, Linda," he continued, his voice thoughtful. "In a way, I feel like I saw a part of myself today that I didn't want to see. All this time I was so focused on being the best, on proving myself, that I lost sight of what really mattered." Linda placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's the beauty of learning, Mark. We all have our blind spots, but Mr. Johnson, he has a gift for helping people see them, for guiding them towards something better. And today, you learned something many people never get the chance to understand." Mark took a deep breath, a sense of relief and clarity washing over him. He realized that Mr. Johnson's lesson had been more than just a gentle reminder about humility and respect. It had been a call to redefine his own values. He wanted to become someone people could trust, someone who saw past appearances and treated every person with the dignity they deserved. It felt like he was starting fresh, with a new purpose that went beyond making sales. "Thanks, Linda," he said quietly, giving her a genuine smile. I think I needed this, and I want to do better, not just for myself but for everyone who walks through those doors." His voice was steady, filled with determination, and Linda could see that the change in him was real. She gave him a warm smile, nodding in approval. "I know you will, Mark. You've taken the first step, and that's what matters. Just keep going, one day at a time." She patted his shoulder and walked back to her desk, leaving him to his thoughts. As Mark stood there, he looked around the showroom once more, seeing it in a new light. It was more than a place to work. It was a place where he could make a difference, a place where he could grow and help others in ways he hadn't imagined before. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready for it. As the last of the customers left and the dealership prepared to close for the night, Mark took a few moments to walk through the showroom, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. The cars gleamed under the dimmed lights, and in the quiet, he could almost feel the presence of Mr. Johnson lingering, as if the older man's words were etched into every corner of the place. He approached the high-end SUV that Mr. Johnson had shown such interest in earlier. This was the same model that had sparked Mark's initial assumptions and arrogance. Now, looking at it, Mark felt a pang of regret, realizing just how quick he had been to judge. He ran his hand over the smooth metal of the car, his fingers brushing against the surface thoughtfully. It struck him that each person who walked into this showroom brought their own story, just as Mr. Johnson had. Stories that couldn't be seen in the way they dressed or the way they carried themselves. In that quiet moment, Mark made a silent promise to himself. He would no longer be the kind of salesman who judged others by appearances or limited them by his own narrow expectations. Instead, he would approach each person as Mr. Johnson had approached him with patience, understanding, and respect. It was a small but powerful shift, one that Mark knew would take time to fully embrace, but he felt ready to start the journey. Just then, he noticed something small and almost hidden near the SUV's front bumper. It was Mr. Johnson's business card, the one he had given the young couple earlier, partially tucked into the edge of the car. Mark picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The simple elegance of the card struck him, the understated font and the discreet contact details. Holding it, he felt as if he were holding a part of Mr. Johnson's legacy, a reminder of everything he had learned that day. He slipped the card into his pocket, knowing he would keep it as a token of the lesson he'd been given. It would serve as a constant reminder of the man who had seen through his arrogance and had, without harshness or anger, taught him one of the most important lessons of his life. As he moved toward the entrance, ready to lock up for the night, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The tension he usually carried, the pressure to perform and prove himself, felt lighter, replaced by a quiet purpose that didn't rely on approval or competition. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged here, not just as a salesman, but as someone who could live up to the values that Mr. Johnson embodied. Before he turned off the lights, Mark looked around one last time, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Tomorrow, he would walk into the showroom with a new outlook, prepared to greet each person with the respect and dignity they deserved. And in his heart, he knew that this was only the beginning. Mr. Johnson had shown him the way, and now it was up to him to follow that path, one customer at a time. With a final nod to the empty room, he locked the door and stepped out into the cool night, feeling the promise of a new chapter unfolding before him. The next morning, Mark arrived at the dealership earlier than usual, a sense of anticipation and purpose guiding his steps. The lessons from the previous day had settled deeply within him, and he was eager to start fresh, armed with the wisdom Mr. Johnson had shared. As he unlocked the doors and walked into the quiet showroom, he felt a renewed connection to the place, seeing it less as a workspace and more as an environment where people came with hopes, dreams, and needs that went far beyond a simple transaction. As he prepared the showroom, Mark took extra care with every detail, ensuring that each car was perfectly polished, each brochure neatly arranged, and every aspect of the dealership ready to welcome customers with warmth and respect. His movements were slower, more deliberate, each one a reflection of the change he felt within. He took a moment to stand by the door, looking out at the parking lot where he imagined people from all walks of life would soon arrive. Today, he would meet them with a new approach, one built on empathy rather than judgment. Shortly after the dealership opened, Mark spotted a young man approaching hesitantly from the lot. He wore a modest, slightly oversized jacket and scuffed sneakers, his posture showing uncertainty as he peered into the dealership windows. The old Mark might have immediately categorized him as a time waster, someone unlikely to buy anything, but today, Mark saw things differently. Instead of assumptions, he felt a genuine curiosity about the young man's story. With a welcoming smile, Mark opened the door and approached him. "Good morning. Welcome to the dealership. Is there anything I can help you with?" he asked, his tone genuine and open. The young man looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected to be noticed or welcomed so warmly. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor before he managed a shy nod. Yeah, I'm actually just looking," he mumbled, clearly unsure of himself. "I don't know if I'm ready to buy anything yet, but I've always wanted to see what these cars look like up close." Mark nodded with understanding, maintaining his friendly demeanor. "Of course," he said, gesturing toward the showroom. "Take your time. We're happy to have you here, whether you're just browsing or looking to buy. Feel free to ask me about any of the models. You'll find a lot of unique features on each one." The young man's face relaxed, and a small, grateful smile broke through his initial shyness. He entered the showroom with Mark by his side, visibly more comfortable with each step. Mark led him to one of the mid-range models, sharing details about its features in a way that felt conversational, rather than sales-driven. As they talked, Mark noticed that the young man's confidence began to grow. He asked questions, each one more thoughtful than the last, as he ran his fingers over the interior of the car, visibly impressed. They eventually circled back to the high-end SUV, the same model that had sparked Mark's lesson with Mr. Johnson. The young man's eyes widened as he took in the sleek design, clearly captivated. Mark watched him for a moment, remembering how he'd once thought this car was only for serious buyers, only for those who met a certain unspoken standard. But now, he felt none of those old restrictions. The car was here to be admired, just like everything else in the showroom, and he was happy to let this young man appreciate it. The young man looked at Mark, his expression hesitant but hopeful. "This one's really impressive," he said quietly, as if admitting a secret dream. "It's way out of my budget, but maybe one day." Mark smiled, recognizing the spark of ambition in his eyes. "You know, dreams like these have a funny way of coming true if you hold on to them," he replied. "A lot of people have come through this dealership with similar hopes, and some of them have ended up driving off in exactly the car they once thought they couldn't have." He gestured toward the SUV, encouraging the young man to sit in the driver's seat. "Go ahead, get a feel for it. Sometimes the best way to keep a dream alive is to picture yourself already achieving it." With Mark's encouragement, the young man climbed into the driver's seat, his hands carefully gripping the steering wheel as if he were holding something precious. For a few moments he sat in silence, taking it all in, his face a mixture of awe and determination. When he finally stepped out, he looked at Mark with gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I didn't think I'd be treated like this. Most places, well, they usually don't think I'm serious about anything like this. But you didn't look at me that way." Mark felt a warmth spread through him, the fulfillment of seeing the impact of Mr. Johnson's lessons taking root. "You're welcome," he replied, meeting the young man's gaze with a smile. "Everyone deserves to be here, no matter where they are in life. And when the time is right, you'll have everything you've worked for. Just keep that vision strong." The young man nodded, his confidence visibly lifted. He thanked Mark one more time before heading out of the showroom, pausing at the door to glance back at the SUV with a look that held both appreciation and quiet resolve. Watching him leave, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose, realizing that he had just experienced the kind of connection Mr. Johnson had talked about, a genuine moment of understanding and respect that went far beyond sales. As he returned to the main floor, Mark couldn't help but feel that he was beginning to honor Mr. Johnson's legacy, bit by bit, with each person he met. Today, he hadn't made a sale, but he had given someone hope, encouragement, and a sense of belonging. And in that moment, he understood that this was the true heart of the business Mr. Johnson had built, a place where dreams were respected, and every person was seen for who they truly were. As the day continued, Mark felt a steady rhythm settle into his work, each interaction carrying a new layer of depth he hadn't felt before. The showroom was busier now, with people from all walks of life exploring the dealership, each with their own needs, stories, and dreams. Mark moved from one conversation to the next, making sure to approach each customer with the same respect and attentiveness that Mr. Johnson had modeled. Around midday, a family entered the dealership, two parents and a young boy holding his mother's hand, his eyes wide with excitement as he took in the cars. The parents looked a bit hesitant, glancing around nervously as though unsure if they belonged there. Mark, noticing their uncertainty, approached them with a warm smile, his tone welcoming and gentle. "Good afternoon. Is there anything I can help you find today?" The mother returned his smile, seeming to relax a little. "Well, we're just looking, really," she said, casting a quick glance at her husband, who nodded in agreement. "We've been talking about getting a new car for a while now, but we're not sure what we want yet." Mark could sense the careful consideration in her words, the weight of their decision apparent in the way she spoke. This wasn't just about buying a car for them. It was a commitment, a step toward something better for their family. He nodded, understanding the significance of their hesitation. "That's a big decision," he agreed, his tone sincere. "Finding the right car for your family is about more than just features. It's about choosing something that fits into your life and brings you peace of mind." The husband's face softened, visibly relieved that Mark wasn't pressuring them. The young boy, meanwhile, tugged at his mother's hand, his eyes fixed on one of the sedans nearby. "Can we see that one?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent excitement. Mark chuckled softly and gestured for the family to follow him. "Of course. Let's take a closer look," he said, leading them to the sedan. As they approached, he shared some basic information about the car's reliability, safety features, and comfort, qualities he knew would resonate with a family seeking security and dependability. He spoke to the parents directly, but he made sure to include the young boy, pointing out the spacious back seat and the extra storage where he could keep his favorite toys or books. The boy's eyes lit up, and his enthusiasm seemed to lift the spirits of his parents too. The father looked at Mark with a nod of appreciation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "We've been worried about making the wrong choice. We don't want to feel like we're being pushed into something we're not ready for." Mark's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on the side of the car. "You're absolutely right to take your time," he replied. "This isn't just a purchase. It's an investment in your family's safety and happiness. My job isn't to sell you the most expensive car. It's to help you find something that genuinely fits your needs." The mother looked at him, visibly touched by his sincerity. "I didn't expect this kind of experience here," she admitted. "Most places we've been to just want to rush us through everything. But you're really making us feel at ease." Mark felt a surge of pride, not just in himself, but in the path Mr. Johnson had set him on. He realized that this family's gratitude was a reflection of everything he'd been taught, to look beyond the sale, to respect each person's journey, and to honor their decisions without pressure. It wasn't just about cars. It was about trust. He spent the next hour with the family, answering their questions with patience and guiding them to a few other models that fit their needs. At no point did he push them to make a decision, instead encouraging them to envision themselves in each vehicle, weighing how it would fit into their lives. He could see their confidence grow, their initial apprehension melting away as they grew more comfortable with him and the process. As they thanked him and left to think over their options, Mark felt a quiet satisfaction settle within him. He hadn't made a sale, but he had built something far more valuable, a relationship founded on trust and respect. He knew that if they did decide to purchase, they would come back, not just because of the car, but because of the experience they had shared. Mark glanced around the showroom, catching Linda's eye from across the room. She gave him an approving nod, her expression proud, as if acknowledging the growth she had witnessed in him. He smiled back, feeling an overwhelming gratitude for the journey he'd been on and the guidance that had brought him here. For the first time, he truly understood what Mr. Johnson had meant about people being the heart of the business. Every interaction, every conversation was an opportunity to connect, to build, to honor the humanity in each person who walked through those doors. And with every person he met, Mark felt his purpose deepen, aligning him more closely with the legacy Mr. Johnson had left behind. As he returned to his work, Mark knew that he was no longer just a salesman. He was a part of something larger, a tradition of respect, integrity, and compassion that transcended the dealership itself. And he vowed to carry that tradition forward, one family, one individual, one act of kindness at a time. The day continued, and as Mark moved through each interaction, he felt a renewed energy, almost as if he were discovering the dealership and himself for the first time. His approach had changed so naturally that it felt as though he'd been this way all along, listening to each customer's needs, connecting with them on a level he hadn't known was possible before. It wasn't about closing deals or hitting targets anymore. Instead, he found joy in the simple act of helping people, of making their dreams a little closer to reality. Each face he met, each story he heard, reminded him of why he was here, to make a difference in ways that went far beyond the cars he sold. As the afternoon settled in, he noticed a familiar face entering the dealership. It was the young couple from the previous day, the same couple Mr. Johnson had helped, giving them the down payment as a gift. They looked different today, more confident, their steps purposeful as they scanned the room. Spotting Mark, they smiled, relief and gratitude clear in their expressions as they approached him. "Hi, Mark," the young man said, extending his hand warmly. "I don't know if you remember us, but we came in yesterday and, well, Mr. Johnson really helped us. We wanted to come back and let you know what that meant to us." Mark shook his hand, his own smile spreading naturally. "Of course I remember," he replied. "Mr. Johnson told me about it, and I'm so glad he was able to help you too. You both really deserve it." The young woman, holding her husband's hand tightly, nodded. "We were honestly overwhelmed by his kindness. No one's ever done something like that for us before. We've been saving for so long, and to finally be able to get this car, it means the world." Her voice softened with emotion, and Mark could see how deeply they had been touched. "Mr. Johnson has that effect on people," Mark said with a chuckle, feeling a swell of pride. "He's taught me a lot about seeing people for who they really are and treating everyone with respect and kindness. He's the reason this dealership feels the way it does." The young man nodded thoughtfully, glancing around the showroom with a new perspective. "You know, we were thinking about how we could thank him," he said, "and we realized that maybe the best way to honor what he did for us is to keep that kindness going, to pay it forward somehow." Mark's smile grew, and he felt a deep sense of warmth for the young couple's sentiment. "I think he'd love that," he replied, his voice sincere. "He's always believed in helping others, not because of what he might get in return, but because it's the right thing to do. If you carry that forward, it'll mean more to him than any thank you ever could." The couple exchanged a meaningful glance, their resolve clear. "We will," the young woman said, her voice filled with determination. "And it's thanks to people like Mr. Johnson, and you, that we even thought of it. This place is different. It's not like anywhere else." Their words struck a chord deep within Mark. He realized that not only had he changed, but that this entire dealership, this small part of Mr. Johnson's legacy, was creating ripples that extended far beyond its walls. Each act of kindness, each respectful interaction, had the power to reach further than he'd ever imagined. The couple stayed for a while, chatting with Mark, sharing stories about their journey, their dreams, and how much this car would help them in building their life together. Mark listened intently, offering encouragement and congratulations, truly happy to have been a part of their story, even in this small way. He knew that they'd remember this experience, not just as a purchase, but as a reminder of the good in people. As they left, the young man turned back, giving Mark a parting wave. "Thank you again, Mark," he called out. "Tell Mr. Johnson we'll keep our promise." Mark watched them go, a profound sense of peace and fulfillment settling over him. The interaction with the young couple reminded him of the purpose Mr. Johnson had instilled in this place. It wasn't just about selling cars. It was about helping people feel valued, seen, and supported. And in that moment, Mark realized that he was doing something meaningful, not just for himself, but for every person who walked through those doors. As he turned back to the showroom, a sense of quiet pride filled him. The dealership felt like a place of hope, of kindness, where everyone could come as they were, knowing they would be treated with respect. Mark knew that Mr. Johnson's legacy was alive, woven into each moment of understanding, every act of generosity, and every genuine conversation, and he was honored to be a part of it. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting a warm glow across the showroom, Mark felt the weight of a meaningful day. He had spent hours connecting with customers, each conversation leaving an imprint on him. There was a sense of peace in knowing he was making a real difference, one interaction at a time. The young couple's words echoed in his mind, how they planned to carry Mr. Johnson's kindness forward, to make it a part of their lives. It struck him that kindness, when genuinely felt and shared, had the power to inspire in ways he had never fully understood. Just as he was reflecting on this, a familiar older man walked through the dealership doors. It was Mr. Johnson himself, dressed in his usual understated style, his presence calm, yet quietly powerful. Mark's face lit up with a genuine smile as he walked over to greet him, feeling a deep sense of respect and gratitude welling up inside him. "Mr. Johnson, it's so good to see you," he said warmly, extending his hand. Mr. Johnson accepted his handshake with a warm smile. "Mark," he replied, his tone gentle and knowing, "I wanted to stop by and see how things were going. I've heard good things." There was a glint of pride in his eyes, one that seemed to speak to his satisfaction in how Mark had embraced the lessons he'd imparted. Mark's expression softened, humbled by the compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I've been seeing things differently since yesterday. I didn't realize how much I was missing until you showed me what it means to really connect with people. It's changed everything about the way I approach this job." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance to learn from you. It means more than you know." Mr. Johnson nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "It's my pleasure, Mark. You know, when I first started out, I was in your shoes. I thought success meant being the best, making the most sales, proving myself to everyone around me. But over time, I learned that real success has nothing to do with those things. It's about the impact you make, the lives you touch, and the legacy you leave behind." Mark absorbed every word, feeling the weight and wisdom of Mr. Johnson's experiences settle in his heart. "I think I finally understand that," he replied quietly. "Yesterday, when that young couple came back, they told me they wanted to carry forward your kindness. It hit me that this job is about more than just cars. It's about inspiring people, helping them feel seen and valued." He paused, glancing around the showroom, realizing how much it had come to mean to him. "And I want to keep doing that. I want to honor the way you've built this place." Mr. Johnson's face softened, his expression filled with quiet pride. "I'm glad to hear that, Mark. This place isn't just a business to me. It's a part of who I am, and I've always wanted it to be a space where people feel respected and understood. If you carry that forward, you're honoring that vision in the best way possible." Mark felt a surge of gratitude and responsibility, knowing that Mr. Johnson's trust in him was a gift he would work tirelessly to uphold. They walked through the showroom together, each car representing a story, each sale a memory of someone who had come seeking something more than just a vehicle. Mr. Johnson stopped by the high-end SUV, the same model that had sparked Mark's lesson in humility and empathy, and ran a hand over the hood, his gaze thoughtful. "This car," Mr. Johnson began, "is more than just a machine. For some, it's a goal, a sign of hard work paying off. For others, it's a dream that keeps them motivated. And for people like us, it's a reminder of what we can offer, an opportunity, a moment to show them respect, and sometimes, even a little hope." He looked at Mark with a gentle smile. "The impact you make isn't always in the sale. It's in how you make people feel. That's what they'll remember." Mark nodded, feeling a new depth to his understanding of Mr. Johnson's philosophy. He realized that every person who stepped into this dealership was bringing a part of themselves, their hopes, fears, and aspirations. His role was not to rush them, to push them, or to judge them. It was to walk alongside them, even if only briefly, and make that part of their journey a little brighter, a little easier. They continued their walk, and Mr. Johnson shared stories from his early years in the business. Stories of people he had helped, lives he had touched, and the mistakes he had learned from along the way. Each tale held a lesson, a piece of wisdom that felt as timeless as it was profound. Mark listened intently, realizing that he was being entrusted with something precious, a legacy built on kindness, humility, and unwavering integrity. As they reached the front doors, Mr. Johnson turned to him, his gaze warm and encouraging. "You're doing well, Mark. Better than I ever expected. Keep going, keep learning, and never lose sight of why you're here. If you do that, you'll find success. But more importantly, you'll find purpose." Mark's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I won't forget. I'll do everything I can to make sure this place and the people who come through it are treated the way you envisioned." Mr. Johnson nodded, giving him a final, reassuring pat on the shoulder. "I have no doubt you will," he said softly. With a parting smile, he stepped outside, leaving Mark standing at the entrance, feeling the weight and warmth of the lessons he had just received. Watching Mr. Johnson walk away, Mark knew that he was no longer the same person he had been just days before. With a deep breath, he turned back to the showroom, a renewed sense of purpose and pride guiding his every step. He understood that his role here was more than a job. It was a calling, a chance to make a difference, one genuine connection at a time. And as he looked around, he felt ready to carry forward the legacy of respect, kindness, and compassion that Mr. Johnson had left in his hands. The days that followed felt like a fresh chapter in Mark's life. Each morning, he arrived at the dealership early, ready to greet customers and colleagues alike with a newfound sense of purpose. The weight of Mr. Johnson's teachings had transformed him, grounding him in values that went beyond sales targets or competition. Now, every interaction felt like a chance to live up to that legacy, to uphold the quiet yet powerful culture that Mr. Johnson had created within these walls. Mark noticed changes not only in himself, but in the atmosphere around him. His co-workers, observing his shift in attitude, began to mirror his approach. Where there had once been rushed transactions and a focus on high-value sales, a quieter, more considerate energy took over. Conversations became warmer, interactions more genuine, and customers seemed to feel it too. They often lingered a bit longer, sharing stories about what brought them to the dealership, trusting that they would be listened to without judgment or pressure. One afternoon, a young woman entered the showroom, her eyes scanning the cars with a mix of excitement and hesitation. She wore a uniform from a local hospital, her name badge identifying her as Clara. Mark noticed her right away, sensing a familiar nervousness in the way she stood by the entrance, clutching her bag tightly. Remembering his own journey to seeing past appearances, he approached her with a friendly smile, his voice soft and reassuring. "Hi there," he said, his tone welcoming. "My name's Mark. Are you looking for something specific today?" Clara looked up, visibly relieved at his gentle approach. She introduced herself, explaining that she had just finished a long shift at the hospital and had been saving up for a car to make her commute easier. "I don't know much about cars," she admitted with a shy laugh. "I've always taken the bus, so this whole thing is a bit overwhelming for me." Mark nodded, understanding the weight of her words. She reminded him of the young couple Mr. Johnson had helped, people working hard to improve their lives but feeling unsure of how to navigate a world of big decisions and high price tags. "I totally understand," he replied warmly. "It's a big step, and it can feel like a lot to take in. But you're in the right place, and I'll be here every step of the way. Let's just start with what you need and what you're comfortable with. We'll take it one step at a time." Clara's shoulders relaxed, and she smiled, her initial hesitation beginning to fade. They spent the next hour walking through the showroom, exploring different models that suited her budget and lifestyle. Mark guided her patiently, answering her questions with honesty, and making sure she felt empowered to make her own choices. He didn't rush her or try to upsell her. He simply provided her with the information she needed, letting her take the lead in finding what felt right. As they talked, Clara shared snippets of her life, stories about the patients she cared for, the long hours at the hospital, and her dream of eventually moving closer to family in a neighboring town. Mark listened intently, touched by her dedication and resilience. In that moment, he realized how much he had come to value these connections, these glimpses into people's lives. Each customer was a reminder that everyone was carrying their own challenges and dreams, and that his role wasn't just to sell them a car, but to honor their journey, however brief their time together might be. Finally, Clara settled on a modest sedan, reliable and within her budget. Her face lit up as she ran her hand over the steering wheel, and Mark could see that she was already picturing herself driving it, the convenience and freedom it would bring to her life. She looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I never thought buying a car would feel like this," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "You made it feel like I was just talking to a friend who wanted to help me, not a salesman trying to make a sale." Mark smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "That's because you're more than just a customer here, Clara. This place is about more than cars. It's about people and making sure they feel valued. Mr. Johnson taught me that. I'm just glad I could help you find something that fits your life." Clara nodded, clearly moved by his words. She completed the paperwork with Linda at the front desk, thanking Mark one last time before she left, her excitement evident as she walked out to her new car. Watching her go, Mark felt a profound pride that he knew Mr. Johnson would understand. A pride that wasn't rooted in numbers or sales charts, but in the simple joy of helping someone else find their way. As the day wound down, Mark took a quiet moment to reflect on the path he'd traveled since his first encounter with Mr. Johnson. He could see, now more than ever, that the impact of Mr. Johnson's teachings had rippled outwards, changing not only his own perspective, but touching each customer who walked through the doors, each colleague who witnessed the transformation. It was a quiet legacy, one that wasn't about wealth or status, but about creating a place where everyone felt they belonged. And as Mark locked up the dealership that night, he felt a deep contentment, knowing he was part of something larger than himself, something lasting, something true. The lessons Mr. Johnson had imparted weren't just about being a better salesman, they were about being a better person, and that, Mark realized, was the real heart of the business. The next morning, Mark arrived at the dealership with his usual early start, feeling the same sense of purpose he'd carried since his transformation began. The air felt fresh, charged with a quiet optimism that mirrored the journey he had embarked on. As he unlocked the doors and prepared for the day, he couldn't help but feel a profound gratitude, not only for Mr. Johnson's guidance, but for the chance to make a meaningful impact every day. Shortly after opening, an elderly couple entered the showroom, holding hands and looking around with a mix of nostalgia and wonder. They moved slowly, taking in the cars with appreciative glances, as if each model brought back memories of the years they'd spent together. Their presence had a gentle warmth, a reminder of a life well lived. Mark felt a familiar pull, the kind he now recognized as genuine curiosity and respect for the stories others carried with them. Approaching them with a warm smile, he introduced himself. "Good morning. My name is Mark. Are you two looking for something specific today?" The elderly man, a tall figure with a kind but weathered face, smiled and nodded. "Well, we've been thinking about getting a new car," he said, his voice carrying the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who valued each word. "It's been years since we bought one, and we're not sure where to start, but we wanted to see what's out there." His wife squeezed his hand, giving him a supportive smile, and Mark could see the quiet bond they shared, a lifetime of companionship in a single glance. Mark's heart warmed as he listened. He guided them through the showroom, starting with models that suited their lifestyle and needs, describing each feature in simple terms, always careful not to overwhelm them. He noticed how they looked at each car thoughtfully, sometimes sharing a private smile or a whispered comment. It was clear that every decision they made together, honoring each other's opinions and preferences. As they examined one particular model, the woman turned to Mark, her eyes soft with a bittersweet emotion. "You know, we've been together for over 50 years, she said, her voice gentle. "We've had our share of cars, raised our children, and now our grandkids are the ones asking us when we'll finally upgrade from our old family car." She laughed softly, and her husband chuckled along, nodding in agreement. Mark smiled, touched by the glimpse into their life. "It sounds like you've made a lot of memories together," he replied, his tone respectful. "A new car will be a part of that, something that fits this stage of your journey." The elderly man looked at him with a thoughtful expression, as if weighing his words. "It's strange," he admitted, glancing at his wife with a soft smile. "We've always seen cars as more than just vehicles. They've carried us through so much. Our first years of marriage, long road trips with the kids, even those late-night drives just to clear our minds. It's almost like each car has been a part of our family." Hearing this, Mark felt a deeper appreciation for the couple's perspective. He realized that for them, this purchase wasn't just about practicality. It was a way to honor their shared history. He guided them to a model that balanced comfort and reliability, the kind of car that could carry them with ease, a fitting companion for the years to come. He let them explore it, giving them space to discuss privately, sensing that this was a decision they wanted to make on their own terms. After a few moments, they nodded to each other, and the man turned to Mark with a smile. "I think this is the one," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "It's not flashy, but it's comfortable. It feels right for us." His wife nodded, a gentle pride in her eyes, and Mark could see that they'd chosen something that honored both their past and their present. As they completed the paperwork, the couple shared more stories from their life together, and Mark listened with genuine interest, feeling as if he'd been invited to glimpse a lifetime of love and resilience. When the transaction was finalized, he handed them the keys, his smile soft and genuine. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "I hope this car brings you as many memories as the ones that came before it." The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she thanked him. "You've made this experience so special for us," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not often you meet someone who understands what this really means." Mark's heart swelled with gratitude and pride. "It's been an honor," he replied sincerely. "This place isn't just about cars. It's about helping people find something that feels like home." The couple left the showroom, walking hand in hand, each holding a piece of the day's experience close to their hearts. Watching them go, Mark felt a deep sense of fulfillment, the kind that went far beyond sales or numbers. It was the joy of being part of someone's story, of making a small but meaningful impact. As he returned to the floor, he thought of Mr. Johnson's words. "The impact you make isn't always in the sale. It's in how you make people feel." Mark understood now that each person who walked through those doors brought something unique, a story, a memory, a piece of their journey. And his role was to honor that, to make them feel valued, seen, and respected. It was clear to him that Mr. Johnson's legacy was alive and thriving in the work he did each day. The business had become more than a job. It was a way to touch lives, to leave people with a little more hope and joy than they came in with. And as Mark prepared for the next customer, he knew that he was part of something rare, something meaningful. In that knowledge, he found a quiet, unshakable peace.